Standing at the podium of St. Matthew's Chapel, staring at the sea of black-clad mourners gathered for my son's funeral, I watched my husband Matthew slide his arm around my sister Aria's waist in the front pew. The gesture was intimate, possessive, and utterly shameless. I set my eulogy papers down with deliberate care, the rustling sound echoing through the sudden silence, and smiled at the congregation. "Before I say goodbye to Gabriel," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane raging in my chest, "I think there's something everyone should know about the father who supposedly loved him so much." What Matthew didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for 2 months, and every single person in this room was about to witness the most devastating truth of their lives. My name is Chloe Harris, and at 41, I had built what I thought was an unshakable life. For 18 years, I had been the perfect wife to Matthew Hall, a successful contractor who owned 3 construction companies across Georgia. For 18 beautiful, complicated, heart-wrenching years, I had been Gabriel's mother, watching him grow from a curious toddler into a brilliant young man studying mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech. But standing here now, with my son's casket draped in white roses just 10 feet away, I realized that everything I had believed about my family was a carefully constructed lie, and the 2 people I had trusted most had been systematically destroying me from the inside. The discovery had happened on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 2 weeks after Gabriel's car accident on Highway 85. I had been going through Matthew's dresser, looking for his insurance papers to handle the mounting medical bills from Gabriel's 3 weeks in intensive care. That's when I found the phone he thought he had hidden so well, tucked behind a stack of old tax documents. The screen lit up with a text notification, and Aria's name appeared with a message that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Can't wait until this nightmare is over and we can finally be together properly. The kid's been hanging on too long anyway." The kid! She was talking about my dying son like he was an inconvenience, an obstacle between her and my husband's affection. I sat there on our bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered papers and the ruins of my entire world, and something fundamental shifted inside my chest. The grief I had been drowning in for weeks suddenly crystallized into something much sharper, much more focused. They thought I was just the grieving mother, too broken by loss to notice what was happening right under my nose. They had no idea that I had spent 12 years working as a paralegal before Gabriel was born, or that I still remembered exactly how to gather evidence that would hold up in any court of law. What they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything for 8 weeks straight. Every secret phone call, every suspicious absence, every lie about where Matthew was going when he left the house during Gabriel's final days. While they thought I was falling apart with grief, I was actually building a case that would expose them in the most public, most humiliating way possible. And what better stage than the funeral of the son they had both betrayed? The irony wasn't lost on me that Gabriel himself had been the one to teach me about hidden files on phones during one of our last conversations in the hospital. "Mom," he had whispered through the oxygen mask, his voice weak, but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had always made me so proud. "People think they delete things, but everything stays somewhere. You just have to know where to look." I had thought he was talking about his computer science projects, but now I understood he had given me the key to uncovering the truth about his father's double life. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, watching my son fight for every breath while Matthew stepped out for yet another important business call, I had started paying attention to details I had been too devastated to notice before. The way Matthew's eyes would light up whenever Aria walked into the room. The way she would find excuses to touch his shoulder or stand just a little too close when she thought no one was looking. The way they both seemed to have entire conversations with just glances, while I sat there holding Gabriel's hand and praying for a miracle that would never come. But what I discovered in that hidden phone went so far beyond a simple affair that I actually felt sick to my stomach reading through their messages. They hadn't just been planning their future together while my son was dying. They had been actively hoping he would die faster so they could move forward with their plans without the complication of my grief getting in the way. Arya had written things about Gabriel that no aunt should ever think, let alone put in writing. And Matthew, the man who had stood at Gabriel's bedside and promised him that everything would be okay, had been telling my sister that he couldn't wait for this whole situation to be resolved so they could start their real life together. That's when I realized that my careful, methodical approach to gathering evidence wasn't just about protecting myself in a divorce. This was about making sure that everyone who had ever respected Matthew Hall as a pillar of our community would know exactly what kind of man he really was. Everyone who had looked up to Arya White as the caring, devoted sister would understand the depth of her betrayal. And everyone who came to mourn my beautiful, innocent son would witness the moment when his father's true nature was revealed for all the world to see. The plan I had been working on for 2 months was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. What happened next would shock everyone in this chapel, but more importantly, it would give Gabriel the justice he deserved, even if he wasn't here to see it himself. The morning Gabriel died, I had been in the hospital cafeteria getting coffee when the monitors in his room started their final, devastating symphony of alarms. By the time I ran back upstairs, my sister Aria was already there, holding Matthew's hand while the doctors performed their last desperate attempts at resuscitation. Even in that moment of absolute devastation, when my entire world was collapsing around me, some part of my mind registered how quickly she had appeared, how naturally her fingers interlaced with his, how they seemed to be comforting each other while I stood there screaming my son's name into the sterile hospital air. But I was too shattered to process what I was seeing. Gabriel Adams Harris, the brilliant, kind, funny 18-year-old who had been the center of my universe for nearly 2 decades, was gone. The boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities on our living room floor and explain to me how bridges worked. The teenager who had taught me to appreciate jazz music and always remembered to call me on his way back to his dorm. The young man who had been planning to spend Christmas break showing me his latest engineering project was now just a still, silent form under a white hospital sheet, and nothing else in the world seemed to matter. The 3 weeks between Gabriel's accident and his death had been the longest, most terrifying period of my life. He had been driving back to Atlanta from visiting his girlfriend Ellie King at the University of Georgia when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The impact had caused severe brain trauma, multiple broken bones, and internal injuries that required surgery after surgery. For 21 days, I had lived in that hospital, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, talking to him constantly, reading him his favorite books, playing the music he loved, and desperately believing that love alone could pull him back to consciousness. Matthew had been there too, of course. At least that's what everyone thought. He would arrive each morning with coffee and pastries, sit with me for a few hours, hold Gabriel's other hand, and speak to him in the gentle, encouraging voice that had made me fall in love with him 23 years ago. But then there would always be a business emergency, a crucial meeting, a crisis at one of his job sites that required his immediate attention. "I hate leaving you alone with him," he would say, kissing my forehead with what seemed like genuine regret. "But you know how important it is to keep the business running. Gabriel's going to need the best care money can buy when he wakes up." And I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. I thought Matthew was working himself to exhaustion to make sure we could afford whatever Gabriel needed for his recovery. I thought he was being strong for both of us, handling the practical concerns so I could focus entirely on our son. I thought his occasional absences were necessary sacrifices, and I was grateful that he was taking care of everything I couldn't handle in my grief-stricken state. What I didn't know was that those business emergencies were actually hotel room meetings with my sister. While I sat beside Gabriel's bed, reading him passages from his favourite Terry Pratchett novels and begging him to squeeze my hand, Matthew was 40 minutes away at the Marriott downtown, planning his future with the woman who was supposed to be my closest family member and strongest support system. Aria had moved to Atlanta from our hometown in South Carolina just 2 years earlier, ostensibly to be closer to me and Gabriel after her messy divorce from her first husband. She had gotten a job as a marketing coordinator at a firm downtown, rented a cute apartment in Virginia Highland, and become a regular fixture at our family dinners and weekend gatherings. Gabriel adored his Aunt Aria, loved her quick wit and her ability to debate him about everything from politics to pop culture. She had been his cheerleader when he got accepted to Georgia Tech, his confidant when he was nervous about starting college, his ally when he wanted to switch from computer science to mechanical engineering against Matthew's initial objections. I had been so grateful to have her close by. After our parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, Aria and I only had each other left from our original family. She had been my maid of honor at my wedding, Gabriel's godmother, the person I called when I needed advice or just wanted to share good news. When Gabriel had his accident, she was the first person I thought to call after the hospital and Matthew. She dropped everything to be there with me, taking time off work to sit in that waiting room during his surgeries, bringing me meals I was too upset to eat, dealing with the insurance companies and paperwork while I focused on Gabriel. Or at least that's what I thought she was doing. What she was actually doing was using her access to our family crisis as cover for an affair that had apparently been going on for over a year. Every time she left the hospital to handle some business or get some fresh air, she was actually meeting Matthew. Every time she volunteered to take care of the logistics while I stayed with Gabriel, she was actually coordinating secret rendezvous with my husband. Every concerned text she sent asking how I was holding up was actually part of an elaborate deception designed to hide the fact that she was sleeping with my husband while our son lay dying. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself, though that betrayal cut deep enough to leave permanent scars on my soul. The worst part was reading through their text messages and realizing that they had been discussing Gabriel's condition like it was a business problem to be solved. They had conversations about his medical prognosis, his chances of recovery, and what his long-term care might mean for their future together. They talked about me like I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be handled with the right combination of patience and manipulation. In one particularly devastating exchange from 3 days before Gabriel died, Matthew had written, "Doctor says it's not looking good. Honestly, might be a blessing at this point. Chloe will need time to grieve, but then we can start over somewhere fresh." And Aria had responded, "I know it sounds awful, but I keep thinking about how much easier everything would be if we didn't have to worry about long-term care costs and family obligations. We could go anywhere, do anything." They were talking about my son's death as a convenience. They were discussing the end of his life like it was a solution to their logistical problems. They were treating the loss of the most precious person in my world like it was a business transaction that would clear the way for their happily ever after. And all of this was happening while I sat beside Gabriel's bed, holding his hand and telling him how much his father loved him, how proud we both were of the man he was becoming, how we couldn't wait for him to come home so we could be a family again. That discovery changed something fundamental in my DNA. The grief I had been drowning in suddenly had a focus, a target, a purpose that went beyond just mourning my son. These two people had not only betrayed me in the cruelest possible way, but they had disrespected Gabriel's memory before he was even gone. They had treated his life like an inconvenience and his death like an opportunity, and they thought they were going to get away with it because I was too broken by loss to fight back. What they didn't know was that my grief had transformed into something much more dangerous than tears. They had no idea what was coming. The funeral planning had given me the perfect opportunity to set my trap. Matthew, playing the role of the grieving father with Oscar-worthy dedication, had insisted on handling all the arrangements himself. "You shouldn't have to worry about these details right now," he had said, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow as he held me while I sobbed into his shoulder. "Let me take care of everything. Gabriel deserves the best send-off we can give him, and I want you to just focus on healing." Such beautiful, caring words from a man who had been counting down the days until our son's death would free him to run away with my sister. But his desire to control the funeral arrangements had actually played right into my hands. Because while Matthew thought he was managing the logistics to make things easier for his grieving wife, I was using every single planning meeting as an opportunity to plant the seeds of his public destruction. When we met with Henry Rodriguez, the funeral director at St. Matthew's Chapel, I made sure to mention how important it was that the service include time for family members to share personal memories. "Gabriel was so loved by everyone," I had said, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue while Matthew nodded solemnly beside me. "I think people would really appreciate the chance to speak from the heart about what he meant to them." Henry had readily agreed, and we had scheduled 15 minutes after the formal eulogy for open sharing from the congregation. What Matthew didn't realize was that I had already reached out to several people who would be attending the service, letting them know that I might have some special memories to share about Gabriel and the family dynamics that had shaped his life. I had been carefully planting suggestions with Gabriel's friends, our neighbors, Matthew's business associates, and our extended family members, hinting that there might be some revelations during the service that would help everyone understand Gabriel better and honor his memory more completely. The beauty of my plan was its perfect simplicity. Everything I was going to reveal was completely true, fully documented, and absolutely devastating. I had screenshots of text messages, call logs that showed the timing and duration of their conversations, credit card statements that revealed their hotel meetings, and even some photographs that Aria had been foolish enough to take and store in her cloud account, which she had forgotten she had shared with me 2 years ago when we were planning a surprise party for Gabriel's 16th birthday. But more than just having evidence, I had spent 2 months carefully choreographing exactly how I would present it. The timing had to be perfect. The reveal had to be gradual enough to build maximum impact, but fast enough that Matthew and Aria wouldn't have a chance to recover or make excuses. And the setting had to be absolutely devastating for both of them, surrounded by everyone whose respect and admiration they had spent years cultivating. 3 days before the funeral, I had a final meeting with Sebastian Thompson, the lawyer I had quietly retained to handle my divorce proceedings. Sebastian had been Gabriel's favorite teacher's husband and had known our family for years, so his presence at the funeral wouldn't seem unusual to anyone. But what Matthew didn't know was that Sebastian would be recording everything that happened during the service, creating a legal record of Matthew's public humiliation that would be very useful when we got to court to divide our assets. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this during the funeral?" Sebastian had asked me, his expression concerned but understanding. "Once you start down this path, there's no going back. Everyone in that chapel is going to know everything about your private life, your family's secrets, your husband's infidelity. It's going to be intensely public and permanently damaging to everyone involved." I had looked at him across his oak desk, feeling calmer and more focused than I had in months. "Sebastian," I had said, "they made their choices while my son was dying. They betrayed him just as much as they betrayed me. Gabriel deserves to have the truth told about what his father really thought of him in those final weeks. And everyone who knew Gabriel deserves to understand what kind of people they're mourning with." The morning of the funeral, I had woken up before dawn and spent 2 hours getting ready with the meticulous care of a general preparing for battle. I chose my outfit carefully. A simple black dress that was elegant but not overly dramatic, minimal jewelry, subtle makeup that wouldn't run when the inevitable tears came. I wanted to look like the dignified, grieving mother that everyone expected to see, not like a woman planning to detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of her son's memorial service. Matthew had been unusually attentive that morning, bringing me coffee in bed, helping me choose my jewelry, even offering to drive us to the chapel so I wouldn't have to worry about anything except getting through the service. "I'm so proud of how strong you're being," he had said, kissing my forehead with lips that had been kissing my sister for over a year. "Gabriel would be so proud of his mother today. You're going to give him the beautiful send-off he deserves." The chapel was packed by the time we arrived. Gabriel had been genuinely popular and well loved, and the turnout reflected the impact he had made on people's lives in his short 18 years. His classmates from Georgia Tech were there, including his girlfriend Ellie King, who was devastated and kept looking around as if she expected Gabriel to walk through the door at any moment. His high school friends had driven up from South Carolina, many of them now college students themselves, but still young enough that losing one of their peers felt impossible and wrong. Matthew's business associates and their families filled several pews, all of them having known Gabriel since he was a little boy, accompanying his father to company picnics and office parties. But what really made my heart race with anticipation was seeing how many people from our extended social circle had come to pay their respects. Our neighbours from the subdivision where Gabriel had grown up, members of our church congregation where Gabriel had been confirmed and had volunteered for youth programs, parents of Gabriel's childhood friends who had watched him grow up and still thought of him as the polite, smart boy who always said please and thank you. These were the people whose opinion mattered to Matthew's reputation and business success. These were the people whose shock and judgment would follow him for the rest of his life. Aria had arrived separately, playing the role of the supportive sister perfectly. She sat in the second pew with some of our cousins from South Carolina, dressed in appropriate black, her expression arranged in lines of grief and concern. Every few minutes, she would catch Matthew's eye and give him a small, encouraging nod, the kind of gesture that would seem perfectly normal to anyone who didn't know they had been text messaging each other throughout Gabriel's final days about how they couldn't wait for this situation to be resolved. The formal part of the service proceeded exactly as planned. Henry Rodriguez delivered a beautiful opening prayer that focused on Gabriel's life, his achievements, his kindness, and the impact he had made on everyone who knew him. Matthew's brother Levi Jackson spoke about Gabriel's mechanical curiosity and how he had always been fascinated by how things worked, from taking apart radios as a child to designing bridge models in high school. Gabriel's girlfriend Ellie King shared a tearful but beautiful story about his generosity and his dreams for the future, his plans to work on sustainable engineering projects that would help communities in developing countries. And then it was my turn to deliver the main eulogy. I walked to the podium with steady steps, my prepared speech in my hand, and looked out at the sea of faces all focused on me with expressions of sympathy and expectation. This was the moment I had been preparing for since I found that hidden phone in Matthew's dresser. This was when Gabriel would finally get the justice he deserved, and when everyone who had respected and admired my husband and sister would see them for what they really were. "Thank you all for being here today to honor Gabriel's memory," I began, my voice clear and strong, despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. Before I share my memories of my son's beautiful life, I think there's something everyone should know about the family dynamics that shaped Gabriel's final weeks, and about the kind of father he really had during the most difficult time of his life. I could see Matthew shifting uncomfortably in the front pew, probably assuming I was about to get emotional and needed his support. Aria was nodding encouragingly, her expression carefully arranged in supportive concern. Neither of them had any idea that I was about to destroy their lives in front of everyone they had ever wanted to impress. "Many of you know that Gabriel spent 3 weeks in intensive care after his accident," I continued, setting my prepared eulogy aside and pulling out my phone instead. During that time, Matthew was often called away on business emergencies, important meetings, crises that required his immediate attention. I was grateful that he was working so hard to make sure we could afford Gabriel's medical care. I thought he was being strong for our family during the worst time of our lives. The chapel was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on my words, probably expecting a touching tribute to Matthew's dedication during a family crisis. I could see some of Matthew's business associates nodding approvingly, impressed by his work ethic even during personal tragedy. What I discovered after Gabriel died, I said, my voice getting stronger with each word, was that those business emergencies were actually something very different. Matthew wasn't working overtime to support our family. He was using our son's medical crisis as cover for an affair with my sister Aria. The silence in the chapel suddenly felt electric, charged with shock and disbelief. I could see heads turning, people looking back and forth between Matthew, Aria, and me, trying to process what they had just heard. Matthew had gone completely pale, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Aria looked like she had been struck by lightning, her carefully composed expression dissolving into panic. I have text messages, call logs, credit card receipts, and photographs that document their affair, I continued, holding up my phone so everyone could see it. Messages they sent to each other while I sat beside Gabriel's hospital bed, holding his hand and praying for him to wake up. Messages where they discussed his medical condition like it was an inconvenience to their relationship. Messages where they talked about his potential death as an opportunity for them to start fresh together. Now the chapel was filled with gasps, murmurs, and the sound of people shifting in their seats as they tried to get a better look at the main players in this unfolding drama. I could see Gabriel's friends looking absolutely horrified, Ellie King covering her mouth with her hands in shock. Matthew's business associates were staring at him with expressions of disgust and disbelief. "I'm going to read you some of these messages now," I said, unlocking my phone and scrolling to the screenshots I had carefully organized for maximum impact. So everyone who came here to honor Gabriel's memory can understand what his father really thought about him during the last weeks of his life. That's when Matthew finally found his voice and tried to stop me. "Chloe, please." Matthew stood up from the front pew, his voice cracking with desperation as every eye in the chapel turned toward him. "This isn't the time or place. Gabriel wouldn't want his funeral to be about this. Think about what you're doing to his memory." The audacity of him invoking Gabriel's memory as if he hadn't spent our son's final weeks treating his life like an obstacle to overcome sent a surge of righteous fury through my veins that steadied my voice and strengthened my resolve. "You're absolutely right, Matthew," I said, my tone calm and measured despite the fire burning in my chest. "Gabriel wouldn't want his funeral to be about your betrayal, but he also wouldn't want the people who loved him to believe lies about who his father really was. So let me share what you actually thought about our dying son." I looked down at my phone and began reading from the screenshots I had organized chronologically, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's sound system to every shocked face in the congregation. September 15th, 3 days after Gabriel's accident, Matthew to Aria. "This is going to complicate things more than we planned. Chloe's completely falling apart and I can't just abandon her right now without looking like a monster. We might have to wait longer than we thought." A collective intake of breath echoed through the chapel. Matthew was standing frozen in the aisle, his face cycling through expressions of panic, anger, and defeat. Aria had slumped forward in her pew, her head in her hands, no longer even attempting to maintain her facade of innocent grief. "September 18th, I continued, scrolling to the next screenshot. Aria to Matthew. "How long do the doctors think he'll last? I know that sounds awful, but we need to plan for different scenarios. If he recovers, that's years of care and expenses. If he doesn't, Chloe will need time to grieve, but then we can move forward." Matthew's response, trying not to think about it that way, but you're right. Either scenario changes our timeline significantly. Now there were audible gasps and murmurs throughout the chapel. I could see Gabriel's girlfriend Ellie King staring at Matthew with an expression of absolute horror and disgust. Several of Matthew's business associates were shaking their heads, their faces twisted with revulsion at hearing how he had discussed his dying son like a financial liability. September 22nd, I said, my voice getting stronger as I watched the destruction I was causing to Matthew's reputation rippling through the crowd like a wildfire. Matthew to Aria. Had to sit through another meeting with the doctors today. They're talking about long-term rehabilitation if he wakes up, possible brain damage, years of physical therapy. Honestly starting to think it might be better for everyone if nature just takes its course. The sound that went through the chapel at those words was unlike anything I had ever heard. A collective expression of shock and moral outrage that seemed to make the very air vibrate with disgust. Several people were standing now, craning their necks to get a better look at Matthew, who had gone from pale to grey and was swaying slightly on his feet as if he might collapse. "Please stop," he whispered, but his voice was barely audible and completely powerless against the momentum of truth I had built up. "Please, Chloe, I can explain. You don't understand the context. You don't know what we were going through." "Oh, I understand the context perfectly," I replied, looking directly at him with all the fury and pain of the past 2 months blazing in my eyes. The context is that while I was reading to our son and playing his favourite music and begging him to fight for his life, you were in hotel rooms with my sister planning your future together and hoping he would die faster so you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of his recovery. I turned back to my phone and found the message that I knew would be the killing blow, the one that had made me physically sick when I first read it, but that I had been saving for this exact moment. September 25th, the day before Gabriel died, Aria to Matthew. "I hate saying this, but I almost hope the doctors are right about his prognosis. Watching Chloe fall apart is heartbreaking, but dragging this out isn't helping anyone. Maybe it's time to prepare for the possibility that letting go might be the most merciful thing for everyone involved." The chapel erupted in chaos. People were standing, shouting, pointing at Matthew and Aria with expressions of absolute revulsion. I could hear Gabriel's friends yelling accusations, his girlfriend sobbing with rage and heartbreak. Matthew's business associates were looking at him like he was a stranger, their professional respect evaporating in real time as they realized they had been working with a man who could discuss his own son's death as a business convenience. But I wasn't finished yet. I had saved the worst for last, the message that had convinced me that public humiliation was the only justice Gabriel would ever receive. "And finally," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the growing tumult in the chapel, September 26th, sent at 11:47 p.m., just 6 hours before Gabriel died. "Matthew to Aria. Doctor pulled me aside tonight, says it could be any time now. I should feel devastated, but honestly, there's a part of me that's almost relieved. This has been hell on all of us, and maybe now we can finally start thinking about our future instead of being trapped in this nightmare." The explosion of outrage that followed those words was unlike anything I could have imagined. People were shouting, some of Gabriel's friends were on their feet yelling at Matthew, and several of our neighbours were looking at him with expressions of such disgust that he actually took a step backward. Henry Rodriguez, the funeral director, was trying to restore order, but his voice was completely lost in the chaos of moral outrage that had consumed his chapel. Matthew tried one more desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Those messages don't tell the whole story," he shouted over the noise, his voice breaking with panic and desperation. I was grieving too. I was scared and confused and not thinking clearly. You can't judge someone's private thoughts during the worst time of their life. That's when I delivered the final blow that I had been saving. The one piece of evidence that would make it impossible for anyone in that chapel to ever see Matthew or Aria as anything other than the cruel, heartless people they really were. "You want to talk about the whole story?" I said, pulling up the final screenshot on my phone, the one that had made me sob with rage and heartbreak when I first discovered it. Here's a message Aria sent you at 2:15 a.m. on the night Gabriel died, just 4 hours after our son took his last breath, while I held his hand and told him how much his father loved him. The chapel fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the air conditioning humming. Everyone was waiting, sensing that whatever came next would be the ultimate revelation, the final proof of the depth of Matthew and Aria's betrayal. Aria to Matthew, sent 4 hours after Gabriel died. I know this sounds terrible to say right now, but I keep thinking about how much easier everything is going to be now. No long-term care, no medical bills, no years of Chloe being consumed with caregiving. She'll grieve for a while, but then we can have the life we've been planning. Fresh start, new city, just the two of us finally. I love you, and I can't wait for our real life to begin. The silence that followed was so profound that it felt like the entire chapel had stopped breathing. Then, slowly, the shock began to transform into something much darker and more powerful. People weren't just gasped or murmuring anymore. They were standing, they were pointing, they were expressing their moral outrage in voices that grew louder and more accusatory with each passing second. Matthew crumpled. There was no other word for what happened to him in that moment. The man who had stood at Gabriel's bedside and promised him everything would be okay, who had accepted condolences from hundreds of people as the grieving father, who had played the role of supportive husband while secretly planning his escape with my sister, simply collapsed under the weight of his own exposed cruelty. He sank into the pew and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs, or might have been the complete breakdown of a man whose true nature had been revealed to everyone whose opinion he had ever cared about. Aria was no better. The sister who had held my hand during Gabriel's final days, who had brought me tissues and coffee and promised me that everything would be okay, was now hunched over in her pew like she was trying to disappear into the floor. Several of our cousins who had been sitting near her had moved away, their faces expressing the kind of revulsion usually reserved for witnessing something truly evil. That's when Gabriel's girlfriend Ellie King stood up, her young face streaked with tears but blazing with righteous fury. "How could you?" she screamed at Matthew, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "He loved you." Even when he was scared and in pain, he kept asking about you, wondering why you weren't there more often. He made excuses for you because he thought you were working to help him. How could you wish for him to die? The dam broke completely then. Gabriel's friends, his classmates, even some of Matthew's own business associates began shouting their disgust and condemnation. The chapel had become a tribunal, with Matthew and Aria as the defendants in a court of public opinion that had already rendered its verdict. They were guilty of the worst kind of betrayal imaginable, and everyone who had ever respected them now saw them for exactly what they were. Looking out at that sea of outraged faces, all of them focused on the two people who had betrayed my son in his final days. I felt something I hadn't experienced since Gabriel's accident. A sense of completion, of justice served, of truth finally revealed. They would never recover from this moment. Their reputations, their relationships, their place in the community they had called home was destroyed forever. Everyone would know what they had done, and everyone would remember Gabriel not as the inconvenience they had seen him as, but as the victim of their unthinkable cruelty. The truth was finally out, and Gabriel's memory was finally protected from the lies they would have told about their devotion and love. This was the justice my son deserved, and it was only the beginning of the consequences they would face for what they had done to him. The aftermath of that funeral was swift and devastating for both Matthew and Aria, but it marked the beginning of my transformation from a woman destroyed by grief into someone who had found her strength in the pursuit of justice. Within 24 hours of my public revelation, Matthew had lost two of his biggest construction contracts, as his business partners decided they couldn't work with someone who had shown such callous disregard for his own dying son. By the end of the week, word had spread throughout our professional and social circles to the point where Matthew couldn't show his face anywhere in Atlanta without encountering people who looked at him with disgust and moral revulsion. Aria fared no better. Her marketing firm, which prided itself on family values and community engagement, quietly asked for her resignation after several major clients expressed concern about being associated with someone who had demonstrated such a fundamental lack of basic human decency. The story had spread through social media with the viral intensity that only comes from witnessing something so morally shocking that people feel compelled to share it. Videos of the chapel eruption, recorded on dozens of phones, had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times within days, making Matthew and Aria infamous far beyond our local community. The divorce proceedings that followed were unlike anything Sebastian Thompson had ever handled in his 20-year legal career. "I've seen plenty of ugly divorces," he told me during one of our strategy sessions. "But I've never had a case where one party had already been so thoroughly destroyed in the court of public opinion before we even filed the paperwork." Matthew's legal team is basically advising him to accept whatever terms you offer because fighting would only draw more attention to what happened at the funeral. And he was right. Matthew, who had once been proud and arrogant about his business success and financial independence, was now a broken man desperate to escape the consequences of his own actions. He agreed to give me the house, the majority of our savings, and his share of Gabriel's college fund that we had never had to use. More importantly, he agreed to my demand that he establish a memorial scholarship in Gabriel's name at Georgia Tech, funded by the sale of his most profitable construction company. Every year, a deserving engineering student would receive financial support in memory of the son whose death Matthew had seen as a convenience rather than a tragedy. But the most satisfying part of the settlement wasn't financial. It was the clause that Sebastian had crafted requiring Matthew to publicly acknowledge his betrayal and apologize not just to me, but to Gabriel's memory. The statement, which was published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and posted on social media, read, "I, Matthew Hall, publicly acknowledge that I betrayed my wife Chloe Harris and dishonored the memory of my son, Gabriel Adams Harris, during the final weeks of his life. My actions were inexcusable. My words about my dying son were unforgivable, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for the pain I caused to the people who deserved my love and protection most." Reading those words in print, seeing Matthew's public admission of guilt and shame distributed to thousands of people who had once respected him, gave me a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to find. Gabriel's story was now permanently part of the public record, not as the tragedy of a young man whose life was cut short, but as the story of someone whose father's betrayal had been exposed and punished. Everyone who read that apology would remember Gabriel not as a victim, but as someone whose memory had been defended and whose honor had been restored. The transformation in my own life was equally dramatic, but far more positive. 6 months after the funeral, I used part of the divorce settlement to start my own legal consulting firm, specializing in helping other women navigate divorce proceedings where infidelity and financial deception were involved. My experience with gathering evidence, documenting betrayal, and presenting a compelling case had taught me skills that proved invaluable to other women in similar situations. Word spread quickly through legal circles about the paralegal who had destroyed her cheating husband's reputation so thoroughly that he had begged to settle rather than face trial. Within a year, my firm had grown to include 3 other paralegals and 2 associate attorneys, all of them women who had been drawn to our mission of helping betrayed spouses achieve both financial justice and public vindication. We called ourselves Phoenix Legal Services because we specialized in helping women rise from the ashes of their destroyed marriages stronger and more powerful than they had ever been before. Our motto, which I had embroidered on a pillow in my new office, was "Truth is the ultimate revenge." The work gave me purpose in a way that I hadn't experienced since Gabriel's death. Every case we won, every cheating spouse we exposed, every woman we helped rebuild her life felt like a small victory for Gabriel's memory. I was channeling my grief and rage into something constructive, something that protected other people from the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. It wasn't the life I had planned when Gabriel was alive, but it was a life that honored the values he had always admired: fairness, justice, protection of the vulnerable, and the courage to stand up for what was right. My relationship with the extended family and social circle that had witnessed the funeral revelation evolved in ways that surprised me. Rather than being embarrassed or uncomfortable around me, most people seemed to view me with a combination of respect and admiration. They had seen me at my most vulnerable moment choose truth over comfort, justice over social convention, and the protection of my son's memory over my own reputation. Several of Gabriel's friends, now college graduates themselves, reached out to tell me that what I had done at the funeral had changed their understanding of what real strength looked like. Ellie King, Gabriel's girlfriend, became like a daughter to me in the years that followed. She had been so traumatized by hearing how Matthew had discussed Gabriel's potential death that she had struggled with trust and relationships for months afterward. But she also found healing in our friendship and in knowing that Gabriel's memory had been defended so fiercely. She would visit every year on the anniversary of Gabriel's death, and we would spend the day sharing stories about his dreams, his kindness, his brilliant mind, and the impact he had made on everyone who knew him. Those conversations helped both of us remember Gabriel not as the victim of his father's betrayal, but as the remarkable young man whose life had been cut short, but whose influence continued to ripple through the world. The scholarship program we established in Gabriel's name became more successful than I had ever imagined. Not only did it provide financial support to deserving engineering students, but it also attracted attention from other donors who were moved by Gabriel's story and wanted to contribute to his memorial. Within 3 years, the Gabriel Adams Harris Memorial Scholarship had grown into an endowment that would support students for decades to come. Each year at the award ceremony, I would tell the recipients about Gabriel's dream of using engineering to help communities in need. And I would challenge them to think about how their education could make the world a better place. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the way I handled the funeral, if I wish I had chosen a more private way to expose Matthew and Aria's betrayal. The answer is always no. Gabriel deserved to have the truth told about how he was treated in his final days. He deserved to have people know that his father's grief was a performance, that his aunt's support was a facade, and that the love they claimed to feel for him was so shallow that they could discuss his death as a convenient solution to their logistical problems. Most importantly, he deserved to have someone fight for his memory with the same fierce intensity that he had brought to every challenge in his short but brilliant life. The last time I saw Matthew was at a grocery store 2 years after the divorce was finalized. He looked older, grayer, and infinitely smaller than the confident man who had once commanded respect in business meetings and social gatherings. When he saw me, he immediately turned away and hurried toward the exit. But not before I caught a glimpse of the hollow look in his eyes that told me he was still living with the consequences of what he had done. Aria had moved back to South Carolina shortly after losing her job, and I heard through mutual relatives that she had struggled to find work anywhere that required professional references or background checks. Standing in my beautiful new office 5 years after Gabriel's death, surrounded by case files of women I had helped achieve justice, and photos of scholarship recipients who were carrying on Gabriel's legacy of using their talents to help others, I can honestly say that my life is richer and more meaningful than it ever was when I was living the lie of a happy marriage. The grief of losing Gabriel will never fully heal, but it has been transformed into something powerful and productive, something that honors his memory while protecting other people from the kind of betrayal that nearly destroyed me. Gabriel Adams Harris lived for only 18 years, but his impact on the world continues to grow through the scholarship recipients who study engineering because of his inspiration, the women who find the courage to leave abusive relationships because of the example I set at his funeral, and the simple truth that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone's memory is to refuse to let their story be rewritten by the people who betrayed them. My son deserved a father who loved him unconditionally, and he deserved to die knowing he was cherished rather than seen as an inconvenience. I couldn't give him those things, but I could make sure that everyone who claimed to mourn him knew exactly what kind of people they really were. That was my gift to Gabriel's memory, and it was the beginning of the rest of my life.